everybody, and thank you for joining us for our 16th Ask Me Anything live video series. If you missed our last AMA on language access in schools, you can still see it on Highest Pennsylvania's YouTube page or on our website at www.highestpa.org and in the video section of Highest PA's Facebook page. My name is Catherine Miller Wilson, and I'm the Executive Director of Highest Pennsylvania, a nonprofit whose mission is to provide immigration legal and social services to immigrants and refugees. Today, our conversation will focus on what's really happening at the U.S.-Mexico border in honor of the MS St. Louis. Every year, we commemorate the MS St. Louis, which was a ship filled with Jewish refugees trying to escape Nazi Germany, turned away from the U.S. on June 6, 1939. Many of the passengers were later returned to their home countries and perished in the Holocaust as a result. We remember the refugees of the MS St. Louis by teaching about what occurred and reflecting on the lessons learned about this, quote, voyage of the damned, unquote, and what we mean when we say never again. This year, we're commemorating the MS St. Louis by ensuring that the United States does not repeat history by turning away those fleeing violence at the United States-Mexico border. Today, we're excited to be speaking with Highest Pennsylvania's own Philip Weiss. Philip is co-director of legal services at Highest PA. Highest Pennsylvania's co-director, Philip Weiss, has been an advocate for immigrant rights for over 20 years and has been with Highest PA for the past 15 years. In addition to his duties managing Highest Pennsylvania's legal staff and his own caseload, Philip oversees Highest Pennsylvania's educational activities and works with our pro bono coordinator to train pro bono attorneys and discusses immigration in English and Spanish language media. Thank you to everyone who has submitted questions already. We're excited for our conversation today. If you haven't already done so, please submit any questions you have during the next half hour in the comments section below. If we don't get to them during this live conversation, we'll answer them in the comments later. Please keep your questions general. If you have specific legal questions or need legal representation, please contact Highest Pennsylvania directly. We cannot give legal advice on Facebook Live. We would also love to hear your ideas on topics for future videos. We hope that through this video series, you can ask any questions you have and learn the truth about immigration and refugee resettlement in the U.S. All right, so welcome, Philip. I'm going to start with some questions from me. Can you give us a sense of what's happened on the border this past year and why?
Sure. So there has been a lot of rhetoric that we've heard from talking heads, from politicians, and from the news media. But I don't think it accurately reflects what's actually happening on the border and really kind of the human toll and suffering that it's taking on individuals who are seeking safety and security. And I think it can boil down to probably three important issues. So first is MPP, or the Migrant Protection Protocols, or really what they are, the Remain in Mexico policy that was instituted under the former president in January of 2019. The second one is the implementation of Title 42 enforcement actions, which occurred shortly after the start of the pandemic in March of 2020. And finally are the impact of the human suffering and toll that two devastating hurricanes took place in the Northern Triangle countries, all three of which kind of, came to a head in what's happening at the border. So kind of addressing the first one is the Remain in Mexico policy. As we all know, until this program was ended in June 1st of this year, 68,000 individuals lawfully seeking asylum in the United States were turned around at the border and forced to remain in Mexico while they were awaiting for their asylum applications to be heard. That was 68,000 individuals who had fled their countries of nationality primarily Northern Triangle, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, but not exclusively. And there were individuals from other countries as well who were forced to remain at the border, essentially in undeclared refugee camps without proper access to water, food, education, and just simple safety. And there were reports of gangs operating in and around these informal refugee camps, where there were murders, kidnappings, and what have you. And so that's one thing that's happened. And so whereas previously individuals who, again, were lawfully seeking asylum in the United States, whereas previously they had been allowed to enter and make their claims in the United States, as is required under international and US law, individuals were forced to remain in Mexico. And so thereby creating this kind of semblance of chaos, which again was chaos and human suffering created by U.S. policy. The second piece is Title 42. And again, Title 42 is a rarely used provision in federal law, which allows the administration to block all entries due to kind of national priorities and emergencies. And so the former administration instituted this with the pandemic. Now, we know that although the pandemic was obviously and continues to be a very serious medical and health crisis, the administration used the excuse of COVID to implement this border-wide policy, which remains in place today. And what we've seen is through the implementation of the migrant protection protocols and Title 42 although there has absolutely, and we can't discount the fact that there has been an increase in numbers, that increase in numbers is not reflective of what is actually happening. It's not a one-by-one account. And what's happening, what we're seeing at the border is individuals who previously, again, would have been allowed to enter and apply for asylum are being turned back at the border, not being allowed to enter at all. And those repeated contacts by law enforcement, by Customs and Border Control, are what's ticking up the numbers. So again, the numbers that we're seeing are not reflective of so yes, although the numbers look much larger than they are, they in fact are not, and are really reflective of those increased enforcement restrictions. And then the last piece that I mentioned, of course, are the devastating hurricanes of Eta and Iota, which all happened in November of 2020, which caused massive devastation in the Northern Triangle countries, kind of adding further fuel to the fire of individuals seeking safety and simply trying to feed their families. So I think those three elements kind of reflect those issues.
Thank you so much, Philip. That's really, really enlightening. And I just want to kind of lift up a few things from what you said. I mean, you talked about these informal refugee camps, right? And I think for our listening audience, it's important for them to understand. So refugee camps, generally speaking, are set up by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, where they set up facilities. Now, they're certainly not grand or beautiful facilities, but they are facilities that are designed to take in people that are fleeing persecution. And so one of the things, as Philip has explained to us, that happened is by pushing people back into Mexico without having any involvement of the United Nations Human Rights Commission to create a facility. You just have people pushed over the border, literally into the street. So if you want to kind of circle back to where we started and the MS St. Louis, it would be as if the MS St. Louis was prevented from entering, which we know that it was, but also didn't turn home because they were desperate to try to get entry. And if they were given some hope that they could get entry, and they would just sort of stay there wallowing in the water without food, without succor, anything like that. And that's really what has happened, pushing people over into a place where there wasn't any facility for them, and preventing them. And I guess the other thing I wanted to lift up are those hurricanes. We certainly hear a lot about hurricanes. We've been hearing a lot more about them in the last several years, right? And these are the impacts of climate change. And so I wanted our listening audience to be aware that this is not, some kind of isolated incident, which is certainly tragic, but something that we don't have to worry about in the future. We absolutely have to worry about it. There's more and more increasing numbers of extreme weather events, and it causes displacement. And so we have to really reckon as a country, and as a world leader with the impacts of climate change, and how we're going to handle the flow of humanity that will happen, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So, so tell us a little bit about how what you described as happening on the border affects clients that Highest Pennsylvania serves.
Sure. So, I mean, again, this is a complicated question, and it's changing on a daily basis. And so, maybe I'll start with kind of the most recent news coming from Washington D.C., and that's the announcement of what the administration is calling a dedicated docket. Essentially, immigration cases, as we all know, take years, and that's in large part due to a massive backlog that's happening in the immigration court system. And the reason for that is unfortunately, it's a system, again, it's a complicated issue, but one has been underfunded, and immigration judges have not been added as needed. And perhaps as importantly, or perhaps more importantly, is the fact that the immigration court system is not an independent judiciary, and is really just a branch of the Department of Justice. And as it's part of the executive branch, it is subject to the whims of the current political powers that be. And unfortunately, what we saw in the last administration is a stripping down of the powers of both the immigration judges as well as the prosecutors by removing prosecutorial discretion. And so whereas previously cases, prosecutors and judges could kind of manage their dockets as needed, the prior administration blew up those systems that are in place in every single judicial system that we have in this country, and essentially said, no, you don't have the right to manage your own dockets. And so really what that did is it just worsened a problem that they sought to. So what needs to happen, obviously, is creating an independent judiciary of the immigration courts so that they have these powers that are enshrined and they're not subject to the whims of the current administration. But that is going to take legislative action, which is going to be complicated. So short of that, the administration is looking to kind of create a more expedited, or as what they're calling a dedicated docket. This just was announced last week, and it's going to be instituted in 10 jurisdictions, which does not include Philadelphia, but we can imagine that will be extended to other immigration courts, including Philadelphia. And that could be highly problematic for several reasons. First is that unlike in criminal proceedings, as most of our listeners will know, in the immigration context, individuals in respondents, or we would otherwise maybe known as defendants in immigration proceedings, do not have the right to counsel if they can't afford one, right? So it's either they pay for a counsel, they find a nonprofit counsel such as from Highest Pennsylvania or other nonprofit providers, or they go without counsel. And unfortunately, many go without counsel. And so by expediting these dockets, you're really jeopardizing due process because individuals will not have the time to secure attorneys. So that's something that's of concern. Now, the administration has said that it's not going to be a rocket docket, which is something that we saw initiated under the prior administration, but they will allow for immigrants in removal proceedings to find counsel. But unless and until there is kind of universal representation for individuals in removal proceedings, this is going to be a serious issue. So that's one thing. There have also, been challenges in terms of local representation, based upon the docket, based upon the court dockets here in Philadelphia. So, the court hearings have restarted and have been ongoing for several months now, but the docket is quite unsteady. And we just had a case of pro bono counsel from a law firm who had taken on representation of a Venezuelan asylum claim, and they were, had spent hours and hours and hours preparing a client, all ready for a hearing that was set, quite some time ago. And with less than a week, they were advised by the immigration court that their case would be postponed. So again, that really undermines not only our own representation, but imagine pro bono attorneys who have dedicated so much time and all of a sudden are told, no, your case is going to sit on the docket again for several years. So trying to attract pro bono counsel to kind of commit to this really important work becomes all the more challenging. So there's kind of these daily challenges that are happening across the board.
Well, thank you so much. I'm curious, Philip, you mentioned the rocket docket. Can you explain to our listeners what that means?
Yeah, so under the prior administration, they created this rocket docket, and I can't remember. I believe that their goal was stated as being that they would complete cases from start to finish, right? So imagine someone detained at the border and then getting a resolution of their case. I believe that they had stated their goal was within 100 days. That never came to fruition because it was simply not possible. Based upon the lack of judges, based upon the backlog that they were already facing, it simply didn't happen. The current iteration of this is this dedicated docket, which expands that 100 days to 300 days. And again, it's not something that I would be formally against if we knew that each respondent subject to that dedicated docket was eligible and able to obtain appropriate counsel. I think 300 days to prepare an asylum claim is not unreasonable in most cases. And it's so long as judges are able to provide continuances and extensions when absolutely needed, right? Documents or evidence is unattainable. The 100-day docket was absolutely outrageous because it would be impossible for anybody to put together a properly prepared asylum application within that required timeline. But again, it really is incumbent upon this administration and Congress to recognize the need. If they want these courts to be adjudicating cases effectively and efficiently, they need to be able to provide counsel. Otherwise, it's really just going to be a monkey court, and it's not going to adjudicate proper cases efficiently or with due process.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. And I think just one other side piece that's important for our listeners to understand, when you are claiming asylum, of course, you have to prove that you've been persecuted. And that often, correct me if I'm wrong, Philip, but that often requires evidence from your country of origin, right? So you were saying, the time it takes to gather evidence. I mean, in a typical asylum case, although no case is typical because they're not all the same, you're writing to witnesses that are, on the other side of the world, and you're asking them to provide copies of things, and they don't necessarily have access to electronic mail or other things that would make that faster. Is that correct?
No, that's exactly right. And I'll give you one concrete example that often comes up in our asylum cases. So, for example, I'm working with a client now from Guatemala who was from one of the indigenous groups in Guatemala, and he was attacked for working within an indigenous rights organization. And he was attacked by a group of individuals where he suffered severe injuries to his hand, where he was hospitalized. And so I'm working with the client to obtain medical records from the small clinic in the small town in this remote area of Guatemala. And so even in the best of circumstances, obtaining that evidence and documentation is complicated. Today, with COVID restrictions and what have you, it becomes all the more complicated. And that's just one of, as you mentioned, Kathy, many, many examples of the complications of receiving that evidence.
That's great. That's very helpful. Thank you. All right, so I want to circle back to the border and the St. Louis, the MS St. Louis. So, what connections can you make between the border situation and the ship that was turned away in 1939? And how can we ensure that something like that doesn't happen again?
Right. So I've been reflecting on this, and the story of the St. Louis really resonates with me on a personal level. My father actually was in Hungary was born in Hungary and lived in Hungary before the war, and his actual intended goal was to flee and to emigrate to Colombia, where he had some family members and were helping arrange an immigrant visa for him to arrive to go to Colombia. And those papers weren't processed in time, and before the war started, and he was unable to flee. And so the story of the St. Louis really resonates personally because it's a story that we all know, and that is of German Jewish refugees fleeing pre-war Germany for safety and security in the West, and they were denied that by multiple countries, including the United States. And so that's a story I think we all know. But something that I didn't make the connection which I think is really important is it is not simply a failure of U.S. refugee policy, which it's reflective of, but really it's a reflection of the inherently racist underpinnings of our entire immigration system. And I'll explain kind of what I mean by that. So there were 937 mostly German Jews on the St. Louis, and they were headed to Cuba, as we all know. And the reason that they were headed to Cuba was because they had received, or most of them had received, kind of a temporary status in Cuba for this explicit purpose of waiting to come to the United States. So these German Jews, again, the majority of them, their ultimate goal was not to go to Cuba, but it was actually to come to the United States. Now, why couldn't they come directly to the United States? They couldn't come to the United States because they were subject to the racist immigration quotas from the 1924 Immigration Act, which essentially restricted immigration from the less desirable countries, including Southern and Eastern Europe, which of course included Germany and German Jews. So just to give you an example, in 1939, when the St. Louis was turned around, Germans were provided a cap of 27,370 visas per year, 27,370 visas for Germans per year. In 1939, that wait list was over 300,000 individuals. So, so what essentially happened were yes, we failed to recognize the humanitarian need at the time when they presented at our borders, absolutely. But really what happened was this was a natural outgrowth of our immigration policies at the time, which was saying, we don't want you here, right? And that's essentially what happened. And there were even, as individuals were negotiating while the boat was parked, outside of U.S. waters, there was a proposal actually to contact, the Germans and tell the Germans, you know what, don't let your nationals out until they've received a visa to leave to enter the United States or another third country. I mean, imagine that, right? We essentially were telling Hitler, or thinking about telling Hitler, don't let them out until they have permission to enter. And again, that is tied to the 1924 immigration quotas. That's the basis of the entire humanitarian disaster. What happened at the end was what 254 of those 900 plus passengers perished in the Holocaust. And the St. Louis was not the only boat that was turned around. There were many, many other boats that were turned around during this time period. And so the lesson to me is clear. Who are the undesirables? Obviously, it's not the Germans, right? The undesirables now have moved, and the undesirables now are nationals of the Northern Triangle countries and other countries, that our country has deemed undesirable. And so we need to again, we will not fully learn the lessons of never again until we understand those underpinnings.
No, that's really so important, Philip, and so well put. I think, that question, who are the undesirables? I mean, it's really about understanding that our country's entire history of immigration policy from the beginning all the way up through and including today is about exclusion, right? That's what our policy is. Our policy is, who do we want to exclude this year? As opposed to thinking about things that I think all of us would agree are legitimate concerns, right? We can have concerns about when people come in, what are we doing about safety? What are we doing about public health? I think those are questions that can be asked. You don't have to exclude entire swaths of people in order to ask those questions. You can ask the questions and have an inclusive policy all at the same time. So that's very, very helpful. All right. So we have only 3 minutes left. So I'll ask you just really quickly, Philip, if you have any specific ways that you can think of for our listening audience to advocate for immigrants at the border who do end up in Pennsylvania. How can those that are listening to us help?
Right. So I think it's important for everyone to understand that the issues and the humanitarian concerns at the border really end up in the states all across the country, including here in Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia, and individuals who are detained at the border and really need your help in the cities and towns where they end up residing here in the United States during the pendency of their hearings. And so there are many, many ways to help. As an example I had given before regarding this Venezuelan family who had the immigration hearing, one is stepping up and being a pro bono attorney. We always have a greater need for immigration legal services for asylum seekers than we have capacity to serve either in-house at Highest Pennsylvania or through our existing pro bono pool. And so we have twice yearly, we have trainings for attorneys who are interested in doing pro bono work. And really this is geared for attorneys who've never touched immigration law. And I'm here to tell you, you can do it. And that work is so, so valuable, though challenging. And so, so one way is offering pro bono services. The other way is really volunteering time. In other ways, if you're an attorney or not an attorney, in providing volunteer services to our clients through Highest Pennsylvania, and whether or not that's through interpretation, assistance, through translation of documents, And as we move out of COVID, hopefully the opportunity again to engage in individual support, and volunteering, that is really helpful for these newly relocated families here in Philadelphia and in our region. And of course, I'd be remiss if I don't mention, financial support for Highest Pennsylvania, as in terms of our legal representation, our case management services for our clients, as well as the direct financial support we've been able to provide for clients. And lastly is and this is the obvious, is advocacy, right? Advocacy both at the federal level, but also on the state level. And there are bills pending in Harrisburg to extend driver's licenses for all residents of Pennsylvania. And so I encourage you to learn more about that and to become engaged in advocacy across, again, state and federal levels to support those individuals who were previously detained at the border.
Great. Thank you so much, Philip. And for our listeners, in the chat, we have the web addresses for volunteering and learning more about advocacy. Unfortunately, we run out of time. For all of you who sent questions that we didn't get a chance to answer, they will be answered in the comments on Facebook. If you want to hear more from Philip, please tune in to Highest Pennsylvania's Facebook Live session, which will happen later tonight at 7 o'clock regarding Haitian temporary protected status. It's for a different audience, for people who are seeking to find out more about temporary protected status for Haitians. Please feel free to tune in. And one more critical note, Highest Pennsylvania remains open during the pandemic. We're continuing to provide remote legal and social services to immigrants in the greater Philadelphia area. And stay tuned for our next Ask Me Anything. As always, you can learn more about how to support DACA recipients, asylum seekers, and other immigrants and refugees at www.highestpa.org. Thank you so much.